Montana Territory, 1882. The wind was howling down from the Rockies when Zadie Whitlow rode into Dry Creek with nothing but a split lip, a cracked rib, and her two children clinging silent in the wagon bed behind her. The town was small, barely more than a main street and a church bell that rang late. Folks turned their heads when she passed, not because she was a stranger, but because she was broken in a way you could see. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her dark hair half fallen from its pins, and her eyes looked like they had stopped hoping a long time ago. She pulled the wagon to a halt beside the livery, boots in the dust, hands trembling on the reins. A man stepped out from the shadows of the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, with a dust-covered hat in his hands and a quiet sort of calm in his eyes. He looked about 30, sun-worn and steady. "You need help?" he asked, voice low and even. Zadie didn't answer right away. Instead, her little boy stirred in the back of the wagon. "Mama," he whispered, his small hand reaching over the side. She turned quickly, brushing his blonde hair back. "It's all right, Gideon, we're here now." The man waited, not pushing. When her eyes finally met his, she said, "I need a place to stay, just for a night." Her voice cracked halfway through. "My children are cold," he nodded once. "Name's Declan Grady. I've got a cabin 2 miles out, safe, warm, you can come if you want, no strings." Zadie hesitated. She had run from her husband in the middle of the night after years of bruises and silence. She had stolen his horse and left behind everything but her children and a sack of flour. She didn't trust Easy anymore, but then Gideon coughed and her little girl, Grace, whimpered in her sleep. "I'll come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Declan helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and respectful. He lifted Gideon gently, then Grace, and settled them into the front bench. Zadie climbed up last, her ribs aching with every jolt of the wheels. They rode in silence through pine and snow, the sky darkening above them. The cabin was small but strong, the light from the windows spilling gold across the snow. Declan opened the door and stepped back. "Go on in," he said. Inside, it smelled of cedar and stew. The fire was already burning. He brought water, warm blankets, and laid out bread without asking questions. Zadie fed the children slowly, her hands shaking as she tore the bread. Declan crouched by the fire, not watching her, just giving space. When the children were curled together on a cot in the corner, their breathing soft and even, Zadie sat by the hearth, arms wrapped tight across her middle. She stared into the flames, then said quietly, "I left him. My husband, I waited too long, but I finally left." Declan did not turn. "You did right," Zadie shook her head. "He'll come looking. He always said he would, if I ever ran." "He won't find you here," Declan said, "and if he does, I do not scare easy." She looked at him then. "Why are you helping me?" He met her gaze. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago." Her chest tightened. She did not cry, she had nothing left to cry with, but something in her cracked open at those words. That night, she slept curled beside her children while Declan sat in the chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, watching the door. In the morning, Zadie woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Gideon laughing for the first time in weeks. Declan was outside, teaching the boy how to feed the chickens. Zadie stepped into the cold morning light, wrapping her shawl tight. Declan glanced over his shoulder. "He's got a good arm, strong." "He gets that from his father," Zadie said quietly. Declan studied her face. "Maybe. But he's got your heart, that matters more." She looked away, her throat thick. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he said, and somehow she believed him. By midday, she knew they could not leave yet. Grace had a fever, and Zadie's ribs made every breath a battle. Declan made no fuss, just cleared a space for them and went into town for more supplies. When he returned, he brought medicine, flour, and a small wooden doll for Grace. Zadie stared at it, fingers trembling as she took it. "You did not have to." "I know," he said. That night, when the children were asleep, Zadie sat across from him at the table. Her hair was brushed, her face clean. "You are kind," she said. Declan looked into her eyes. "You are safe." She swallowed hard. "I thought love meant pain." "Every man I ever knew proved that." Declan reached forward slowly and rested his hand over hers. "It does not have to." She stared at their hands, at how gentle his touch was. She did not pull away, something shifted in her chest. Not pain, not this time, but the beginning of something else. Something she was almost too afraid to name. Home. And for the first time in years, she let herself hope. The snow fell slow and soft the next morning, thick enough to muffle the sounds of the forest beyond the cabin. Zadie stood by the window with Grace in her arms, the child's breath warm and even against her collarbone. She watched Declan splitting kindling near the shed, his coat dusted in white, movement steady and sure. She hadn't asked him to stay close, but he hadn't gone far since they arrived. He moved like someone used to silence, but not loneliness. Inside, Gideon sat cross-legged on the floor, carving careful lines into a piece of pine with a dull-bladed knife Declan had given him the night before. Zadie had watched the exchange without a word, unsure how to measure a stranger who handed her son a blade but then sat beside him, teaching him how not to cut his fingers. Now, she laid Grace back beneath the quilt and stepped out onto the porch. The wind tugged at her shawl, but she didn't flinch from it. Declan straightened and glanced at her. "She's sleepin' better today. She's cooler than she was," Zadie said. "I think the fever broke." He nodded once, then rested the axe against the railing. "You ever do any canning?" She blinked at the question. "I used to, before. There's preserves in the root cellar. Thought maybe you'd want your hands in something familiar." Zadie studied him. "You offering me work?" "No," he said. "Offering you something that's yours if you want it." She crossed her arms, unsure what to do with the strange weight that settled in her chest. "I don't know what's mine anymore. You will." He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching on the packed snow. "Just takes time." She didn't follow him right away. Instead, she stayed where she was, fingers gripping the rail. The quiet here didn't press like it had back home. It rested gently, like a wool blanket instead of a closing door. Later, while Grace napped again and Gideon sat near the hearth reading aloud from a Bible with missing pages, Zadie stood in the root cellar with her sleeves rolled and her hands sticky with pear syrup. She hadn't touched a mason jar in years, not since the bruises on her wrists made it hard to grip glass. Declan lowered a crate beside her. "You're faster than I expected." "I used to make 50 jars in a day," she said. "Had to, come harvest time." He crouched beside her, not reaching for the fruit, just watching her move. "You miss it?" "I miss being useful," she said. "I miss not being afraid." "You're not afraid now," he said quietly. "Not like you were." Zadie didn't answer right away. "Then you sure about that? You're still here." She looked down at the jar in her hands. "I don't know what staying means anymore. It means you've got a choice." Declan's voice stayed even, but something in it gripped her. "And nobody's gonna take it from you." That night, Gideon fell asleep with his head on Declan's knee, the boy's breathing soft and even. Zadie had meant to move him, but Declan only rested a hand gently on the child's shoulder, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She sat across from him, her feet tucked beneath her skirt, watching the firelight play along the wall. For the first time, the cabin felt lived in. There was a bowl of peeled apples on the table, a mended sock drying by the stove, and Grace's little shawl draped across the back of a chair. "Why are you alone out here?" she asked him. "You don't seem the type to hide." Declan looked into the fire for a long while before answering. "I came west after the war, didn't have much left back east, just ghosts." Her voice softened. "You lose someone, my brother, Chickamauga. And the man I was before." Zadie felt the ache in that, not just the grief, but the hollow after it. "I know that feeling." He looked up, eyes steady. "I reckon you do." They didn't speak again for a while. The fire popped softly. Outside, the wind had gone still. When Declan finally spoke again, his voice was different, not softer, just more certain. "You don't have to keep running." She held his gaze. "I don't know how to stop." "You already have." Zadie felt the heat rise behind her eyes, but she didn't look away. She didn't cry either. Instead, she reached out, slow and unsure, and laid her hand over his where it rested on Gideon's shoulder. Declan didn't move, just turned his palm upward and let their fingers settle together. No promises, no declarations, just warmth, and the beginning of something strong. The first thaw came slow, the snow pulling back from the edges of the fields like a tired tide. The days stretched longer, and Zadie found herself waking before the children, listening to the soft creak of the pine rafters and the sound of Declan moving quietly outside. She started helping without being asked, sweeping ash from the hearth, washing the bed linens in melted snow, setting aside the last of the winter onions before they spoiled. The rhythm of the days was new but steady, and she carried herself differently now. Not lighter exactly, but firmer, like someone who had learned again how to stand. One morning she stepped out to find Declan at the fence line, mending a break in the rails. He had stripped off his coat, sleeves rolled to the elbow, jaw set with focus. She leaned against the porch post, arms folded. "You always fix things before they fall apart," she asked. He turned, brushing sawdust from his palms. "I try." She stepped down into the yard, boots crunching on the half-frozen ground. "I used to wait, let things break. Thought if I ignored the cracks, they wouldn't spread." Declan didn't speak, just watched her. "I got good at pretending," she said. "You're not pretending now." "No," she said, quieter. "I'm not." She walked with him to the barn, where Gideon was helping water the mule. Declan handed her a brush without a word, and she ran it gently down the animal's flank. Afterwards, she lingered by the wall, watching him oil the bit and bridle. "My mother was a seamstress," she said. "Taught me to stitch before I could read. Told me that if a woman could keep a hem straight, she could keep a house standing." Declan looked over at her. "You think she was right?" "I think she was tired," Zadie said. "She married my father because she didn't see another choice. I told myself I'd never live like that. And then I did." Declan didn't offer comfort. He just listened the way a man does when he means to carry what you say, not fix it. "I made Grace's first dress out of an old feed sack," she said, tore it and started again 3 times. "Couldn't get the shoulders right." He leaned against the stall door. "You still have it," she shook her head. "He burned it the day she spilled milk on the floor." Declan's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She was grateful for that, for the silence that made room for her words instead of crowding them. Later that afternoon, she found a bolt of muslin in a box near the stove. It was coarse and yellowed, but whole. Declan didn't mention it, just left it where she'd see it. By evening, she'd stitched a new dress for Grace. The sleeves were uneven, but the hem was true. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a clay mug. Declan poured 2 fingers of whiskey into his own and waited. She looked at him across the lamplight. "Do you ever think about marrying?" He didn't answer right away. "Sometimes." "Why haven't you?" "I never met someone who made staying sound better than being alone." She nodded slowly. "I used to think love meant giving in. Swallowing yourself for someone else." He set his glass down. "It doesn't." "No," she said. "I'm learning that now." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "It can mean steadiness. It can mean rest." Zadie's breath caught. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "You already have." She looked down at her hands, calloused and stained with flour. When she looked back up, he was still watching her, not expectant, just present. "I don't want to be beholden to anyone ever again," she said. "You won't be," he said. "Not here." "Not with me?" She rose slowly and crossed to him. Her hand found his, fingers lacing with quiet certainty. He stood, and for a long moment they didn't move. Just stood in the hush of the firelight, 2 people who had lived through more than they'd ever spoken aloud. He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "You're safe," he said again, softer this time. Zadie pressed her forehead to his chest, and for the first time her body didn't flinch at closeness. She breathed in the scent of pine and wood smoke, and something else, something solid and real. His arms came around her slowly, like he knew all the places where she still carried caution, and she let herself lean in, not because she needed saving, but because she'd found someone who saw her as already whole. The wind turned warmer by mid-March, loosening the earth and waking the creek behind the cabin. Water ran soft against the banks, and the air carried the faint, sharp scent of thawed pine. Zadie stood barefoot in the doorway with her skirt gathered above her ankles, watching Grace stack small stones into a crooked tower while Gideon chased a beetle through the grass with the solemn focus of boyhood. Declan leaned against the porch rail beside her, arms crossed, his hat tilted back just enough to catch the sun. She glanced at him sideways. "You ever think about leaving this place?" "Once or twice," he said, "but I never found a reason that held." She brushed a lock of hair back from her cheek. There's a world beyond this ridge. I used to dream about it. Places with fine linens and silver trains, gentlemen who write letters. Do you miss it? He asked. I never had it, she said. Just stories in my head. Declan looked out toward the trees. I went to Chicago once, after the war. Thought I'd try carpentry in a city. Too loud. Too many faces that didn't see you. She studied him, then said, You'd rather fix a fence alone than build a staircase for someone who won't remember your name. He nodded. That's about right. Zadie stepped down into the yard, the grass cold beneath her feet. She crouched beside Grace and helped her steady the stones. Her hands remembered this kind of gentle work, things that required care but didn't bruise. Later, while the children napped and the sun slanted through the windows, Declan opened a worn cedar box and set it on the table. Inside were tools not for the barn but for carving. Small blades, smooth-handled and sharp. He lifted out a half-finished figure, its edges rough but beginning to take shape. I started this last winter, he said. Didn't know what it was supposed to be. Zadie reached for it. The shape was becoming a bird, wings half lifted. Why'd you stop? Didn't have a reason to finish. She turned the figure in her hand. You do now? I think so. That evening, Gideon asked about the scar on Declan's shoulder, the one that curved like a hook just below the collarbone. Declan didn't flinch. He set down the plate he was drying and said, Minnie A. Ball, September of '63. Zadie's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. Gideon sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide. I was lucky, Declan added. My brother took one through the lung. Didn't make it? Gideon was quiet a moment, then said, Did it hurt? Worse losing him than getting hit. After the children were asleep, Zadie sat beside Declan on the porch bench, a quilt across their knees. The stars were sharp above the pines, and the frogs had found their voices again. She traced the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. I used to dream of running, not toward something, just away. And now, I think I want a garden, she said. Beans, maybe carrots, something that grows slow and honest. Declan didn't speak, just shifted his hand so it rested beside hers. She looked at him. You think it's foolish? No, he said. I think it's the truest thing you've said yet. She turned her hand and let her fingers rest in his. I never had slow before, never had safe. He looked at her then, and his voice was low. You have both now. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I thought love meant pain, she said. He was quiet a long moment, then said, It doesn't. The porch creaked beneath them as the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere out beyond the barn, a night bird called. Zadie closed her eyes. It could mean home. Declan's hand closed gently around hers. It does. And in that quiet, with the sky laid wide above them and the children safe in their beds, she let herself believe it. For the first time, she reached forward into a life that wasn't borrowed or braced against. A life she could build from the ground up, with someone who would never ask her to disappear. Not a dream. Not a rescue, just love, steady as soil. By early May, the trees behind the cabin wore new green, and the riverbanks had shed their ice. Zadie stood in the garden bed behind the barn, a spade in one hand, dirt under her fingernails, and sweat dampening the back of her neck. She had cleared the ground herself, one stone at a time, and now the first rows of beans and cabbage sat tucked beneath the soil like promises. Declan came around the side of the barn with a coil of fencing. He paused when he saw her kneeling in the row, her skirts pulled up above her boots, hair knotted at the nape of her neck. You missed a spot, he said, nodding toward the far corner. She sat back on her heels. That one's for the squash, it needs more space. He crouched beside her, brushing a bit of soil between his fingers. Never seen anyone plant with such certainty. I'm not certain, she said, just stubborn. He glanced at her with a quiet kind of warmth. That's served you well so far. They worked in silence after that, the kind that settled easy between two people who'd come to know the shape of each other's presence. When Zadie stood to stretch her back, she saw Gideon and Grace gathering twigs by the creek, their laughter echoing faint across the field. Declan straightened beside her. You ever think about what's next? I used to be afraid to, she said. Now I think about it too much. He wiped his hands on his trousers. I was thinking about building another room off the back of the cabin, something proper for the children. Zadie turned to him. He wasn't looking at her, just out toward the pines. You mean for us to stay? I do, he said. If you want to. She studied the lines of his face, the settled brow, the way he didn't press, just waited. You're not the kind of man who says things unless he means them. No, he said, I'm not. She stepped close, dirt still on her palms. Then yes. I want to. That evening, she boiled potatoes with sage and baked the last of the winter apples into a crisp. Declan helped Gideon cut kindling, and Grace sat on Zadie's lap while she stitched a tear in her apron. The cabin smelled of bread and pine smoke, and the windows were open for the first time since autumn. After supper, as the children dozed on the rug, Declan brought a small box from the top shelf. He opened it slowly, revealing a thin gold band with a pearl set in its center, the kind passed from mother to daughter in quieter families. It was my mother's, he said. She wore it every Sunday. I've kept it 15 years. Zadie's breath caught, but she didn't speak. I've got no way to do this like a man in town might, he said. No preacher, no paper, but I'd give you every day I've got left, and I'd raise these children like they were mine from the start. She reached out, her hands shaking more than she expected. You already have. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. They didn't kiss right away. They just stood there, hands clasped, while the fire cast long shadows and the children's breathing filled the corners of the room. The next morning, Zadie walked into Dry Creek with Declan beside her and the children nestled in the wagon bed. The town no longer felt like a place to pass through. They met with the circuit judge who passed through once a season, signed their names with quiet dignity, and walked out man and wife. That summer, the trees grew thick and heavy with needles, and the garden gave more than Zadie expected. She canned tomatoes with Grace, who stood on a crate to reach the counter, and Declan taught Gideon how to sand wood smooth enough to run your palm across without catching a splinter. The new room rose slow but sure, every board fitted by Declan's hand, every nail driven with care. Zadie sewed curtains from a bolt of calico, and Declan carved their initials into the doorframe with Gideon watching close. At night, Zadie lay beside him beneath a quilt she'd pieced herself, her hand resting over his heart, steady and warm. He never asked her to be soft, only true. And in return, she gave him all of herself, grit, grace, and the tender hope she'd once thought gone for good. They weathered a hard frost in September, a fever in Grace that broke after 4 days and 4 nights, and a black bear that wandered too near the barn. Through each trial, they met it together, not with noise, but with quiet resolve and faith in what they'd built. By the time the first snow dusted the ridge again, the house stood whole with smoke curling from its chimney and 2 children laughing inside. And when Zadie looked out across the field rows long harvested, firewood stacked high, she no longer saw a place she'd fled to. She saw home. She cupped Declan's cheek as they stood at the threshold, his arms strong around her waist. You gave me back my name, she whispered. He shook his head. You never lost it. You just needed someone to say it without fear, and when he kissed her, it was not a beginning, not a rescue, not a dream. It was the middle of something steady and real, and it was hers.